By the year 1780, the American Revolution had been going on for 5 years. The British could not understand what was taking so long to put it down. After all, they had the largest army in the world, the largest, most powerful navy in the world. And they were fighting poorly trained Continentals, untrained militia, farmers, shopkeepers, and what they called damned banditti, the men from over the mountains. General Washington was encamped in Morristown, New Jersey. He had just gone through a terrible winter, worse than the one at Valley Forge 2 years before. His men had improper food, no clothing, supplies were low, all kinds of supplies, no pay. He was beseeching Congress in the United States for money. His army was about to melt away. He said the only thing holding this army together was their patriotism. And that cement would not last forever. Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander, occupied New York City. He was living in a comfortable home, plenty of good food, good wine, parties at night. He was in no hurry to go out and chase Washington around the countryside. So the war was at a stalemate. Back in England, the British were going broke fighting this war. For them, this had become a world war. Not only were they fighting us here in the colonies, they were fighting the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. Parliament wanted the war to end. The British people were suffering severe shortages of their own for food. They wanted the war to end. However, King George really liked his American colonies, and he was not about to give them up. So, they came up with a new plan. They called it the Southern Strategy. They believed the colonists down south, mainly the Carolinas, were more loyal to the crown than the ones up north where the rebellion began. So, in the winter of 1780, Sir Henry Clinton left New York with over 100 ships and over 8,000 soldiers. His destination was Charleston, South Carolina, the largest and wealthiest city in the South. He had a very hard voyage. Weather was bad. Some ships were blown off course. Some sank. He lost all of his horses. But he landed south of Charleston in March, gathered up supplies, what he could, marched up toward Charleston, surrounded the city, and began to lay siege. Charleston was defended by General Benjamin Lincoln. He had about 5,000 or so Continentals. Put up a good defense as best he could, but he was outclassed, outnumbered, he knew it. The good people of Charleston beseeched him to surrender because they didn't want their city leveled by British cannon, which they were about to open up on the city. So he surrendered. The entire Southern American army was gone. All the supplies, the men, the weapons, everything went now in British hands. Clinton, assured that success would come easily, sailed back to New York and left Major General Charles Cornwallis in command. He was to subdue South Carolina. After that, march into North Carolina, do the same there, and then Virginia, get behind Washington, where Clinton would then come out of New York, surround him, and make him, cause him to surrender, end the rebellion. That was their plan. He advanced north, occupied Charlotte, North Carolina. On his right flank, he had Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton and his mounted dragoons. Tarleton was a young man, vicious young man, hated anyone that was disloyal to his king. He raided homes of patriots, attacked any troops he could find, mainly Buford's men, who came down to aid in Charleston. They found out the city had fallen, so they turned around and head back. Well, he caught up with them, massacred them, would take no prisoners, butchered them. They called them Bloody Band. On the left flank was Major Patrick Ferguson. Now Ferguson, he didn't like Tarleton, first of all. They did not get along at all. Ferguson was cut from different cloth. He believed that these colonists, they were still British subjects, and they could be turned once they were convinced that England was going to win this war. And it looked like they were at this point. He raised over 2,000 Tory militia, trained them in the British coat of arms, mainly use of the bayonet. And they were loyal to him. Congress decided to send another army to try to stop Cornwallis. They quickly got together, a small group, and against the advice of George Washington, placed General Horatio Gates in command. Now, he was known as the hero of Saratoga for what he had done a few years before, but his leadership qualities were questionable. He put his weakest men, after a forced march in the middle of August, it was hot, and they didn't have proper food again, put his weakest troops against Cornwallis's most experienced on the line when he ran into them north of Camden. Another disaster. The entire American army was killed or captured. Horatio Gates mounted his horse and rode 200 miles nonstop to Hillsborough. It was a feat back then. He was an old man. Now there was no one left to stop Cornwallis. But then, 2 days later, at a place called Musgrove's Mill, a group of howling, screaming backwoodsmen came pouring out of the forest and attacked Ferguson's camp, inflicting over 200 casualties, and then melted back into the woods over the Blue Ridge Mountains, out of reach. Ferguson was very upset about this, so he paroled a prisoner he caught at Musgrove's Mill, a man by the name of Samuel Phillips. He was a cousin of Isaac Shelby, who was one of the American commanders in Musgrove's Mill. He sent Isaac over the mountains to find Colonel Shelby and deliver a message. And that message was, if you do not desist in your opposition to the British arms and come under the protection of my standard, I will march my army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste your country with fire and sword. That message did not have its desired effect. Colonel Shelby was not the kind of man to run and hide, cower under such a threat. He hopped on his horse and rode 40 miles to his good friend, John Sevier, the Nolichucky settlements. John was at the end of a 2-week wedding celebration, but Shelby rode up there and they sat down and they discussed this problem, this threat from this arrogant Englishman threatening to burn them out and hang them. They agreed that they had to stop him over the mountains, not wait till he came over to attack their homes. Together, they didn't have enough men. Each had about 240 or so militia in their commands. They knew that wasn't enough. So they sent word to Colonel William Campbell in Virginia, who had a much larger force. But at first, Campbell refused. He thought it better to keep his troops together in case the Indians attacked or the British, because there were lead and salt mines in his area that must be protected. Isaac Shelby wrote him again saying, you must join us to take care of this threat. It must be stopped now. He relented and agreed to send 200 men for his militia. A call of arms went out to the surrounding areas. The militia started to gather. They agreed to meet at a place called the Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River. On September 25th, 200 mounted men thundered across the Watauga River to join the men already there. Charles and Joseph McDowell, they were there already with about 160 or so militia. Later that afternoon, that scene was repeated, but Colonel Arthur Campbell crossed the river with an additional 200 men. Now they knew they would have enough. That night, they looked out over the broad plain at 1,000 campfires It was the largest group of humanity any of them had ever seen in their lives. I camped there that night, traveling from camp to camp, making new friends, seeing old friends. I don't think any of us got much sleep. The next morning, as we prepared to leave, we were packing our horses, and a man stepped forward, well known in the area, Presbyterian minister, the name of Reverend Samuel Doak. He stepped up to give us a sermon and a prayer. Reverend Doak.